Sandra M. Gilbert is a distinguished literary critic, poet, and professor emerita at the University of California, Davis. The author, most recently, of Judgment Day poems. She lives in Berkeley, California. Susan Gubar is an acclaimed memoirist, literary critic, and professor emerita at Indiana University. The author, most recently, of Late Life Love, a memoir. She lives in Bloomington, Indiana. Together, they are the authors of The Madwoman in the Attic, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and the editors of the Norton Anthology of Literature by Women, among other volumes. In 2012, they were awarded the Ivan Sandrov Lifetime Achievement Award by the National Books Critics Circle. As most of you already know, The Madwoman in the Attic was published in 1979 and became one of the first books of feminist literary theory. It examined books by the Brontes, Mary Shelley, and Jane Austen, women writers who are now safely part of the canon, but who in the 70s were rarely granted serious attention in scholarship or on syllabi. It was one of the first books that I read during my first year at Brown University, and it quite literally changed my life. It convinced me to pursue my lifelong dream of becoming a writer. I know countless friends and colleagues who were equally influenced by this book. The title comes from Jane Eyre's Madwoman in the Attic, and one of Gilbert and Gubar's brilliant insights that the madwoman is not simply a Gothic trope. She is not only the manifestation of Charlotte Bronte and Jane Eyre's anger trapped in the attic of their minds. She is the rage of all women forced into an overlooked corner of any narrative. As Constance Grady writes in her introduction to her interview in Vox on September 1st, The Madwoman in the Attic gave us a way of reading the passionate, violent emotions of women writers who for a long time were considered bland, passive, and boringly angelic. In Still Mad, they return to their project of reading women's fury. It covers the grand sweep of contemporary feminist women writing, from Sylvia Plath, Adrienne Rich, Joan Didion, Susan Sontag, through to Claudia Rankine, who, by the way, will be reading for the Hudson Valley Writers Center on Zoom on May 25th. So mark your calendars for that. Reading their work as part of a single continuous movement, Gilbert and Gubar track the ways in which feminism survived the ebb and flow of popular opinion to reach a new relevance after the 2016 election. Please help me welcome Gilbert and Gubar.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a lovely introduction, really just lovely. Thank you so much. We're so delighted to be invited. Still Mad is a companion, not a sequel, a companion to The Madwoman in the Attic, which we wrote, was it half a century ago? And which deals with women writers in the 19th century. Still Mad says the 20th and 21st century women writers, like their predecessors, are still angry, and sadly, they are often still angry about the same old injustices. We began this book. Could we start the slide?
Yes.
Thank you. Why don't we go to the second one? Thanks. We began this book when various disabilities made it impossible for us to travel to the 2016 Women's March in Washington, D.C. It reminded us of the 1970s Women's March, which is on the right in black and white, or it was.
Got it.
Thank you. So it reminded us of the 1970s Women's March on the right, though the presiding spirit of each event could not have been more different. In 1970, many feminists believed that the social order was changing and equality was within sight. However, in 2016, most protesters were shocked that a competent and seasoned female candidate had been defeated by a corrupt huckster. What had happened?
Hillary Clinton was part of the generation that came of age in the 70s, and the contradictions in her life reflect the tensions and ironies that many participants in the second wave of feminism experienced. We were told to reach for the stars, but also to stand by our man. We were encouraged to read Socrates and Plato, but became connoisseurs of sweater sets and pleated skirts. These paradoxes shaped the lives and works of the literary women who gave the second wave its words. Sylvia Plath, for example, on the left, you was here, wanted to become a triple threat woman, to succeed as a wife, a mother, and a poet. The life she led in the 50s and the poetry she produced in the early 60s, for example, Daddy, Lady Lazarus, the B sequence, illuminate the terrible contradictions that destroyed her, even as they made her an icon, as did her posthumously published novel, The Bell Jar. Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich on the right, with Meridel Lasser, became very good friends in the 70s. But in the 50s, they too struggled with the tension between their literary ambition and their efforts to conform to restrictive views of women's place in the home with husband and children.
We're going to move to the next slide. This is Lorraine Hansberry. She was one of the few women in the 50s steeped in feminist intellectual history. Lorraine Hansberry studied Mary Wollstonecraft, Sojourner's Truth, Ida B. Wells, Simone de Beauvoir. In her prize-winning play, A Raisin in the Sun, Hansberry suggests that the domestic ideology of the 50s weakens women, and that in any case, this ideology rarely shaped the destinies of most Black women. Like Hansberry, the next slide depicts the poet Gwendolyn Brooks on the left, who herself wrote about working class Black women, some alienated from the white women who hired them. All these women composed works about the toxicity of enforced domesticity before 1963, the date when Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which is not to take away from her achievement, but to contextualize it. We'll go to the next slide now. Throughout the 60s, liberal women were organizing in Now, while the singer Nina Simone was extending the insights of the civil rights and Black Power movement to confront the unique difficulties of Black women. Her evocative 1964 song, For Women, can be read as a feminist polemic, a counterpoint to her friend James Baldwin's book, Nobody Knows My Name.
In the 60s, Gloria Steinem wrote about contraception and Playboy bunnies. Her evolution illuminates the link between the sexual revolution and the emergence in the 70s of Ms. Magazine. You see an updated version here of one of its early covers. Later in the 60s, Susan Sontag, whose image we should see Susan Sontag now. We need the next slide, I think. Here she is. Later in the 60s, Susan Sontag was one of many women writers, including Mary McCarthy, Grace Paley, Denise Levertov, active in protests against the Vietnam War. War resistance paved the way for the eruption of feminist protests in the momentous year 1968, when the first witch actions sparked headlines. In the 70s, Sontag would go on to write 3 philosophical treatises on feminism, which strangely and sadly went largely unread at the time.
In fact, we didn't know about them until we started writing this book.
That's right.
By 1970, when Kate Millett published her groundbreaking Sexual Politics on the left, and Toni Morrison on the right published her haunting novel, The Bluest Eye, feminism was making headlines. Millett stands for other theorists in the 70s, Shulamith Firestone, for example, Robin Morgan, just as Morrison stands for other novelists in the 70s who focused on the destructive socialization foisted on girls. Novelists like Erica Jong, Rita Mae Brown, and Marilyn French.
James Tiptree, Joanna Russ, Ursula Le Guin. These are the three most significant authors of speculative fiction in the 70s. Alice Bradley Shelton called herself James Tiptree Jr. and really did, among science fiction fans and colleagues, pass as James Tiptree Jr., although you see she was definitely a woman. Like Adrienne Rich, the poet laureate of the second wave, all three imagined the awakening of feminist consciousness in dystopias and utopias. Their heroines discovered the horror of patriarchy's power over women, or they seek to envision a good and no longer masculinist world of gender equality. In the 70s, too, Alice Walker and Maxine Hong Kingston linked women's subordination to racial, ethnic, linguistic, geographic, and religious factors. In doing so, they began to lay the groundwork for the ideas about identity politics, transnationalism, and intersectionality that would arise in the 80s. In 1979, Judy Chicago's dinner party, here is Judy Chicago, and here is an image of the dinner party, assembled plates representing women artists around a large triangular table to celebrate women's creative achievements. Though her mostly white cast of characters and the vaginal images on her plates would soon come under attack as racist or essentialist.
Okay, we'll move to the next slide now. Thank you. During the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the work of Andrea Dworkin on the left, Gloria Anzaldúa in the center, and Toni Morrison on the right, elaborated upon identity politics, transnationalism, and intersectionality, as did the poetry of Adrienne Rich. Dworkin in her battle against pornography, Anzaldúa in the concept of mestiza consciousness, Morrison in her prize-winning novel Beloved, as well as her critical publications on race and gender, and Rich in essays and poems about being part Jewish or split at the root. By the 90s, feminist academics like Eve Sedgwick on the left and Judith Butler on the right were responding to the homophobia fueled by the AIDS epidemic to enlist feminists in defending the rights of gay men. In the process, they generated queer theory, as well as much of the language we now use about non-binary, genderqueer, or transgender people.
Such poets as Anne Carson also sought to dismantle outworn gender binaries, as did postmodern entertainers. Think of Madonna and transsexual authors, for instance, Leslie Feinberg and Kate Bornstein. But by the end of the 90s, feminists, radical, liberal, straight, gay, Black, Chicana, post-colonial, post-structuralist, postmodernist, transsexual, third wave were splintered in an American culture that persistently lumped them all together and denounced them as, in the infamous words of Rush Limbaugh, femin Nazis. Not pictured here are the women who joined in this backlash against feminism.
So it's a relief to land in the 21st century with Alison Bechdel on the left and Eve Ensler, who now calls herself V. In her graphic novels, Fun Home and Are You My Mother, Bechdel explored the impact of the second wave on parents born before it and daughters born after it. In multiple performances of her celebrated play, The Vagina Monologues, as in her subsequent global campaign, 1 Million Rising, Ensler, or V, sought to raise consciousness about ongoing violence against women. In 2008, the next slide, please. Thank you. In 2008, Susan Stryker brought out her transgender history. And in 2016, Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts won the National Critics Circle Award. Both reflect the rise of transgender studies and the prominence of trans as well as non-binary advocates within feminism.
At the same time, feminist writers were aligning themselves with activists against ongoing racial injustice and ongoing environmental threats to the planet. Claudia Rankine's Citizen makes Black Lives Matter. while N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy describes the suffering inflicted by cataclysmic climate changes after the acceleration of global warming. As the Me Too movement evolved, Patricia Lockwood's memoir, Priest Daddy, and Rebecca Solnit's essays protested what Solnit called mansplaining in a society that continued to be ruled by patriarchs, often vicious in their subjugation of women.
Next slide, please. Beyonce is probably the most famous example of the growing impact of feminism on American popular culture today, especially in her movie Homecoming, which repeatedly quotes Audre Lorde, Toni Morrison, and other pioneers of Black feminism. In the next slide, you're going to see Margaret Atwood, also a celebrity. Her Handmaid's Tale was reinvented as a TV series at the start of the Trump administration. And she composed its hopeful, no, can we go back to Margaret Atwood, please? She composed its hopeful sequel, The Testaments, to suggest that sisterhood is still powerful enough to bring about a better world. The feminist imagination continues to rely on dystopic and utopian fantasies. While the second wave was going through a revival in the 21st century, and now we can go to the next slide, such political figures as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Stacey Abrams, herself, by the way, a novelist, were mobilizing the disenfranchised to secure their rights under the law.
And they were doing this while Nancy Pelosi was the most powerful woman in American politics. I think there's a new test.
Ha ha ha.
Who was
Yeah.
saying ha
I
ha?
didn't know we were live.
Oh, well, Nancy Pelosi was the most powerful woman in American politics, second in line of succession to the presidency. Like many of her colleagues, Pelosi wore a white suit when she tore up Trump's State of the Union speech before television cameras to honor the suffragists who fueled her anger and paved the path to rebellion.
After the shocking defeat of Hillary Clinton in 2016, it was especially wonderful to celebrate the triumph of Vice President Kamala Harris in 2020, the first woman to rise to such prominence, as well as First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, the first Lady to continue pursuing a professional career out of the White House. Of course, there was backlash against them all, most shockingly on January 6th, when toxic masculinity and proto-fascism raged through Washington, D.C.
Did the glass ceilings feminists had shattered issue in the broken windows of the Capitol? Will mad women always spawn mad men? We managed to evade such a gloomy conclusion when 22-year-old African-American Amanda Gorman recited a poem on the inaugural stage. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation.
All the women of the feminist movement who met, marched, struggled, and brought a new order into being helped teach her those words, and now would echo them. But for now, we finished our slide presentation, and even though we didn't say anything at all questionable, we are happy to entertain all and each of your questions, as well as objections from the person who said, ha, 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 ha.
Yeah, that was Alice. If Alice wants to ask anything about that, but everyone else should try to keep themselves on mute. And Sophia and I will go ahead and go back and forth and try to answer all the questions that we've received today. And we'll try to also pose all of the questions that we received now tonight in the chat. Okay, so let's see. Let's start with a question that many people have asked us, which is, could you please talk a little bit about your collaboration and what it has meant to you over all of these years?
Oh, it's meant the world to us. We dedicated the book to each other. it started out, as I said, almost half a century ago when we met in 1973. And the mechanics of the collaboration might be more interesting to your viewers than the personal aspects of it. But I have to say that we collaborate differently in almost every book that we write. With this book, we divided up authors. And Sandra's a poet, so she got a lot of the poets, but not all. She was not greedy. And then we rewrote, and we didn't have a lot of technological know-how, but we did understand finally about the speaker, what is it called, Sandra? The
speaker phone.
The speaker phone, that you could put the phone on speaker, and that you could then sit at your computer, both of you, she in California, me in Bloomington, and you could actually talk without holding the phone and write at the same time. So a lot of the collaboration for Still Mad occurred on speakerphone, with us revising pretty much every sentence, and to such an extent that I don't think either one of us ever felt comfortable owning any section of the book, because we rewrote it together so completely.
We went over the entire text together, and I think it's very seamlessly, configured so that you can't really imagine who wrote what. We can't even anymore, because we rewrote each other's writing so much. But I want to say one other thing about collaboration. The collaboration on the Madwoman was a way of trying to do something that we had never been trained to do or imagined that we would do. We had neither of us studied women's history. We had never had women teachers in college. We had never been taught the works of women writers in classes. And so here we were doing something unprecedented, and it was anxiety inducing, and it was such a good thing to have each other, that we were able to both inspire each other and conspire with each other. We were able to protect each other and also go out on limbs together. And I think that was really important. It meant
no question about that. I would also add, though, that we were junior, and that we're very careful in that book to say who was the prime author of which chapters. Yeah, because when we applied for fellowships together, the humanities was not used to collaboration.
No, that's
scientists always have been, biologists and even social scientists, sociologists, but humanists are not used to collaboration. And so we never got a grant together for writing them to get time off from teaching. And so we understood that we were vulnerable. I was particularly vulnerable because I was untenured. Sandra, I think you were tenured, but you weren't a full professor yet.
No, I was tenured, but I wasn't a full professor.
Yeah, but we were pretty careful in those early books to indicate who was responsible for what, because we were afraid people would say to us, well, she wrote it. Yeah, the other one, right. Whoever the other one was, she wrote, right. If it was me coming up for tenure, they would say, well, Sandra wrote it. Or if it was Sandra coming up for full professor, they would say, well, Susan probably wrote it. They just weren't used to the concept of collaboration. And so we were pretty careful on that one. Right. But after that, I think there were so many books together and the anthologies as well. In some cases, we didn't divide things up at all. I mean, there are some books in which we actually literally wrote every word together in the same room.
At the same time, with two notebooks and two pencils.
Two notebooks, two pencils, laughing maniacally usually, right. And also arguing and quarreling and quibbling. Right. But so there have been many different kinds of collaboration we've engaged.
Right. But what's interesting about collaborations, a point that W.H. Auden made about his collaboration with Chester Coleman, I think, is that a kind of third voice arises, a third collaborative voice. And we can say to each other, well, that's not the way we would put it. We don't say it that way, or we won't do it that way. That's not what we do. We know what we do. And what we do is this other thing that's different from what we do separately in our other works, in our individually authored works. It's just a different, it's wonderful to have that. It's really fascinating that there's this collaborative voice that arises and inspires.
And this collaboration has inspired so many other people to write collaborations and to do academic scholarship in the humanities as collaborations. I love reading that in the beginning for Madwoman, you actually had to mail chapters back and forth physically and wait for those pages to come. And it's so interesting now that you have speakerphone, you're rewriting sentences together. I guess even I don't think you probably did Zoom for Still Mad because the pandemic.
The real breakthrough for us was the computer, and the first book we did with the computer was the Norton Anthology of Literature by Women.
We actually have a question about the Norton Anthology of Literature by Women. We have someone who wants to know if you're working on a new edition for that.
No, we are not. No, we are not. But I just want to go back a minute, just a little bit and then we'll come back to that.
Yes.
I think for us, the email was huge because we were spending so much money on the phone, long distance with Sandra in Berkeley and me in Bloomington. And also there's a big time shift, 3 hours, so I can't call her at 9 a.m. because she'd be fast asleep. So for us, I think that the email and the computer really made possible the Norton Anthology of Literature by Women, which was a huge undertaking, which we could not have done with a brilliant editor, John Benedict at Norton, who came and visited us and worked with us hands-on.
I used to work in his office too, and I would threaten to jump out of the window if one of my favorite poets was going to be cut.
Right.
Here I go. You don't want Ruth Stone in here? Oh no! Here I go. I'm on the windowsill.
He was a marvelous editor and very caring about women and women writers.
Was Adrienne Rich's editor?
He was
Adrienne's editor. Yes.
Exactly. But no, we are not working on a new edition. It went through 3 editions, and in the 3rd edition, it became 2 volumes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where we've decided to leave it for now. Sandra, wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have another question in the chat about collaboration from Rachel Haddis, who asks,
hello, Rachel. Hello,
says,
Rachel. Nice to, we can't see you, but it's wonderful to know you're there.
collaboration must have been especially comforting during the pandemic. Also, it's so true that humanists do not collaborate as naturally as scientists. Is that changing now, especially among women scholars?
I don't know. I've had a number of students over the years who would come to me and say that they were so inspired by the Gilbert Gubar collaboration that they were going to try to collaborate on something, and it didn't work out for them. I mean, I think there's just a certain chemistry you have to have. I do believe there are, but I don't know. I don't have a list of feminist collaborators at the moment. Maybe that's just my not knowing about some.
Well, let's not forget that Gilbert and Sullivan weren't talking to each other at the end of their
they had a big fight about a carpet. It was a fight about a carpet in the subway.
So it's not always a happy blendship.
That's true. That's true.
I do think it takes a certain kind of chemistry, although at this point we have so much history together that we know so much about each other and each other's reading and each other's writing that it makes it a happy. I just read a wonderful novel called I think it was called The Neat Little Box or The Beautiful Little Box. That was a collaboratively written novel. So I do think 2 women in Brooklyn, and it was a very charming book. Somebody in your audience will remember the real name of it better than I do. But I think people are doing all kinds of collaborative work together. I really do. And not just critical, I think creative as well.
Oh yeah, my friend Marilyn Hacker, the poet, just did a series of Renga with another woman in Paris. They were locked down during the pandemic, and they were sending each other these poems and responding in poetry. And the book just came out. I just got a copy of this wonderful book that they did.
We have a small press. It's called Soppering Hall Press. That's part of the Hudson Valley Writers Center. And we have a series of conversation chapbooks where a more established woman poet writes a book in conversation with an emerging woman poet of her choice. And then at the end, they have a conversation that we publish at the end of the collection. So right now we have Dorian Lau and Leela Chati who are doing that. And we've had Denise Duhamel, who loves collaborative poetry, and Amy Lemon and Kimiko Han and Kimiko Han and Kimiko Bayer. So we see a lot of that in poetry, and we love to support that. We have another question from someone in the audience asking about, would you say the sort of feminist readings you pioneered in Madwoman have now gone mainstream? Do you think that most of what you have written about and what you're writing about now is more in the mainstream than when you were first writing about it?
Oh, I think there's no question that's right. When we were looking for pockets of anger and rebellion and rage in 19th century narratives, we were looking at it in the attic. We were looking in small sections of the plot, or at minor characters very frequently. And I think the difference between Still Mad and the Madwoman in the Attic is that rage is now public, and that women have a public voice in politics and in economics and in medicine and in law. The sad thing is that the anger is still directed against sort of recalcitrant injustices that they were protesting in the 70s, and were very hopeful that things were going to get better. So, things like childcare, things like, abortion rights, control over the body, equal pay, injustice related to domestic abuse and sexual abuse. And yet we still find, yes, these women are public. Many of them are teachers. Many of them are in the public sphere. They've been on television. They've been on radio. They express their anger much more openly, but they're still angry at many of the same problems that the 19th century women writers were angry about.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the comment that was supposed to be unheard, the ha, when I mentioned Nancy Pelosi. Excuse me. Pelosi was, she was certainly theoretically the second most powerful woman. She was second in line to the presidency as the Speaker of the House, wearing that white suit. She was able to do publicly what nobody in the 19th century could have done. She's standing in the front of the assembled Senate and the House of Representatives, and she tears up the president's speech in an act of ferocious.
Very self-consciously in front of the TV cameras.
Yes, making sure that the cameras are on her, making sure. So, just that act and that image is something that would have been so impossible, I would think, even 50 years ago. Even 30 years ago. Somebody who was in that position of power doing such a thing, such a transgressive thing to the actual words of the president. Of course, it was also unprecedented that the president was what he was, which is what caused her to do what she did. And that's another question we have to ask, how it came about that we had, even while we had someone like Nancy Pelosi in the position that she was in, that we had someone like Trump in the position that he was in, a misogynist, a bore, a bigot, for all we know, a rapist.
And a bigot, let me just add, who was elected by many women voters.
Yes, and we had a lot of questions about that. If you could talk a little bit about why you think, after so many gains had been made, why we're back with Trump in that position with women voting him into power.
one of the themes of Still Mad is the prevalence of backlash against feminism from the get-go. The first wave, certainly, the second wave, no doubt. But also the oddity that backlash was spearheaded by white women. At the center of this book, as a part of this woman's backlash, is Phyllis Schlafly, who was loved by Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was one of the people who eulogized her at her funeral. So this is something that we think about from the beginning in the 50s with the woman, the lost sex, Marina Farnia, all the way through to today, where we see Marjorie Taylor Greene, or whatever her name is. I don't even want to say her name, but we see this backlash, mostly white women attacking feminists and feminism.
Right. There was I once heard on NPR some woman in, I don't know, Idaho or something, being interviewed about Trump, and she said, "Oh, I'm really for him. He makes me feel so safe." So there were women who, I can't imagine anyone who could be made to feel safe by him. I mean, seems to me that he makes everyone feel unsafe. He made everyone feel frightened all the time and horrified. But this woman said, "Oh, he makes me feel so safe."
But this is a question that feminists have to address now in the future. There's no question about it. This is a real primary question that feminists have to raise in the future. And Andrea Dworkin wrote a whole book about this back in the 80s or 90s. I mean, it's been going on, as I say, since the 50s and throughout the first wave. But I think this is a political issue that feminists need to address more bluntly and more pointedly than they have.
Well, it's as though there's among women, there's a shadow divide, just the way there's this famous divide in the country, where the country is so divided between blue and red, or north and south, or whatever it is. There is this division among women, that because there are women who are either, whether or not they're pro-Trumpers, they're anti-feminist women, and there are feminist women. And I don't think that there's a third sort of woman. I mean, many of our students would say things to us like, "I'm not a feminist, but it would turn out after the but, they said, "But I do believe in equal pay for equal work, and I do believe in this, and I think we should have childcare." So they were feminists. So women really are feminists or anti-feminists. If they're Phyllis Schlafly, they want to preserve the power of the MRS degree. And if they're not Phyllis Schlafly, they want to be liberated from the shadow of the MRS and to be able to be free to be themselves and chart their own and walk their own walk in their own way. And it's an extraordinary divide.
We have a question about how does that fit in with the divide of racism? How does this fight about getting women on side also connect with ongoing issues with racism with the feminist movement?
I think that's really the heart of it. I think in feminism itself, what we track in the book is really from the get-go. I mean, look at the origins we just traced in that slide PowerPoint thing. We begin, with Lorraine Hansberry, and we talk about Gwendolyn Brooks, and we talk about Nina Simone. From the very beginning of the second wave, African-American women and Chicana women were playing a huge role in diversifying feminism and distinguishing it from the first wave, which was so white dominated. Although there were, of course, Sojourner Truth, and there were, of course, Ida B. Wells and people like that. But in the second wave, there's no question that what we call intersectionality, that is Toni Morrison's view that you can take into account racism and sexism and understand that they don't always function analogically, that there's sometimes in tension, but that you need to consider both. I think that's been a major triumph of the second wave. And I think what your questioner is getting at is that the anti-feminism that you see now in America is tinged by a kind of racism.
Oh, yes, I think that they double each other in a way, just as the divides double each other. The divide, the pro-Trump and the anti-Trump camps and are completely divided, and the feminist and anti-feminist camps are completely divided, and they shadow those splits, those sort of terrible and almost theatrical splits. Why Trump happened when he happened, however, is another question. And why, I mean, it does have something to do with Hillary Clinton. It has something to do with a woman running for president. And that would be worth thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not answering that question, I'm just raising it.
Anne Bookman asks, how can we move beyond anger to effective grassroots organizing and a national women's movement that's multiracial and cross-class?
Well, if we knew the answer to that question, I think we would be happy campers.
Yeah.
I don't fault the women's movement, though. I think they have done that. I think women, they're, you know, when we trace the kind of grassroots protests against the Iraq War, when we traced, you know, women's grassroots efforts to get women politicians and feminists in office, we were very impressed, leading up to someone like Stacey Abrams, but going way back. The issue I keep on thinking has a great deal to do with backlash, and the backlash also has a lot to do with not only racism but anti-Semitism. I mean,
Yes.
It's a very difficult question, the question that was posed.
But in fact, these kinds of women's groups are still active. For example, I don't know whether you noticed that Emily's List just said today that they would withdraw their support from cinema if she continued to behave in the way she's behaving about the filibuster.
I didn't see that.
And they are a powerful group. They've given her a lot of financial support, evidently, and it will be interesting to see what kind of reaction there is.
With the internet, there are a lot of people working on feminist issues in blogs and in zines and in venues that Sandra and I don't know because we're too old and we don't read those sorts of things, like, you know, but Instagram and TikTok and who knows what else.
Oh, my granddaughter knows a lot about all those. Yes. Goes to feminist marches.
But we really see ourselves more as literary historians and less as prophetesses of the future.
Yeah, I don't think that we can, although this might be the place to bring in Yvonne Boland's great line, our future will become the past of other women, which is the most wonderful prophetic line that I've ever heard. It's a very inspiring line, and it was one of her last poems.
Along those lines, what are you two reading right now for hope, for balm? What are you reading for guidance? And what follow up to that, what are you working on right now?
Well, we were reading Mrs. March, which was a hilariously, how would you describe it, Sandra? Macabre about a mad woman.
Comic but macabre novel about somebody's mind unraveling. It was about somebody who was getting mad. I mean, she was not still mad, she was becoming mad in the course of the novel. And it was like a sort of anti-Mrs. Dalloway in a way, just to come out. Now I can't remember the Virginia, what was her last name, the woman who wrote it?
Saito,
right? Yeah, wonderful book. We recommend it to everybody. Yeah, but no, I'm working on a book about poets, and I'm right now working on Edna St. Vincent Millay, in whom I've always been interested, and so this will be my third go go round with Millay. And it's always fascinating to be working on her and to think about the phenomenon that she was. She was a passionate feminist. Her husband had been married to Inez Milholland before she died, and then he married Millay. And but Millay became a feminist who impersonated feminism. She gave all these incredible readings all over the country, dressed in amazing gowns. I once, like Lockwood in Wuthering Heights, went up to Steepletop to visit the house and to meet the sort of caretaker of the house. And I got stuck there overnight because it was snowing, and it was at the Steepletop is really at the top of a mountain, and I couldn't get out. So I was invited to stay over. I slept in Millay's husband's room, and in the course of the night, Elizabeth Barnett, who was then the caretaker of the house, asked me if I would like to see her gowns. So I went into the room where Elizabeth Barnett slept, which was Millay's room, and there was a closet full of the amazing gowns, the paraphernalia of her artifice, right, in which she presented herself as the ultimate femme fatale, little girl femme fatale to the world. It was just an extraordinary experience. And at the same time, the Millay family had not, or the Millay caregivers had not done anything about preserving her manuscripts at that point. So as I fell asleep, I could hear rats rustling in the attic among the papers. It was really, I mean, the next thing would be like, like Lockwood, to have a little cold hand come in through the window and say, let me back in. It was like being in Wuthering Heights.
Well, I'm reading, I just read basically Rebecca Solnitz's new memoir, which I was very moved by. I also read the new novel by Patricia Lockwood, which I thought was just absolutely breathtaking. There is somebody who is in touch with the electronic, the world of the web, and understands it in a way I don't, but it's a very powerful and experimental work of fiction. As for myself, I am writing a book called How She Aged, about the inventive endgames of women artists who lived long lives at least in relation to their time periods. And in it, I'm interested in why George Eliot in the last year of her life married a man who was young enough to be her son. I'm interested in how Georgia O'Keeffe managed to pen a best-selling autobiography when she was blind, and how Isaac Dinesen managed to write stories like Babette's Feast when she couldn't eat. I'm very interested in the life of older women, the lives of older women, and how it affects their productivity and their creativity.
It's a fascinating subject.
Thank you.
Fascinating subject.
Do you know when that's coming out?
Oh, no, I'm slogging. I'm in what we call, Sandra, the Gobi.
The Gobi Desert. The Gobi Desert.
We get this phrase from Edith Wharton, who, when she was in the middle of something, said she was in the Gobi Desert, blogging away. No, this is not coming out any day soon. This is a big project, and I'm in the Gobi.
Well,
I can't remember what the beginning is, but the middle is the Gobi Desert and the end is A Night with a Lover.
Sandra, we have a lot of poets in the audience tonight. And so we'd love you to talk a little bit about poetry, your poetry, how it's been for you also to write about poetry, and poets that you'd like us to read more of.
Oh my. Well, I've always found myself, my sort of basic ontological identity is as a poet. And whenever I'm working on a book of criticism of some sort, I've always been writing poems that seem to be somehow in tandem with that book. My dissertation was on D.H. Lawrence's poetry, and I wrote very Lawrentian poems at that time. And when we were working on the Madwoman in the Attic, I published a book of poems called Emily's Bread, referring to both Emily Bronte and Emily Dickinson, both of whom were bakers and, you know, little homekeeping people from the point of view of some male critics. And now I'm writing. I can't quite figure out what this has to do with the work that I've been doing. Well, the work that I've been doing has been in Still Mad, and in this book that's hypothetically called Lonely Poets. I'm thinking a lot about biography, and the poems that I'm writing are kind of autobiographical in a very strange way. They're sort of spots of time from my own life that are written from a kind of sardonic perspective. And I think I intend to call the series Biopics, because each one is a sort of flare illuminating an individual episode. As to who I can recommend, there are so many great poets. I mean, you seem to have had most of them at your place. I'd see you had Jane Hirschfeld, whose work I love and admire. You're having Claudia Rankine, who is so wonderful. I mean, I would say that all the poets that you're, Dorian Laux is a wonderful poet. I'm not sure that I have anything new to tell you, except that I have this new book by Marilyn Hacker, and that Marilyn has another book coming out too that I haven't seen yet. And this is such a range of women poets. Some of, you know, Marilyn is a formalist. Jane is a kind of Zen master of a poet. I mean, they're all so different and yet also wonderful. My great obsession about poetry was, of course, my fascination with the late great Ruth Stone, who seems to be never to have gotten the audience that she deserved, but now her granddaughter Bianca Stone has gotten an audience, and I just came out with a new book that was reviewed on NPR's Morning Edition. So I could recommend that. I can't remember the title of it, but her name is Bianca Stone. You'll find it right away. She's very good.
What advice would both of you give to someone who is just starting a new writing project for the first time? Maybe a first book of poems, or a first big academic research project?
Well, I can't speak to the poems, but I can speak to the academic research project. And my advice would be seat of the pants to the seat of the chair.
Oh, yes.
It's just hard work. It just means leading a kind of lonely, reclusive life, and just sitting there and knowing there will be bad days and where there's only a paragraph, if that, and that there will be better days when there's
being obsessive.
I would definitely encourage being super obsessive.
Right. And as for the idea of starting a new book of poems, I just want to say, from my point of view as a poet, one doesn't start a new book. You don't say, I'm going to write a book of poems. You write poems. And then after you've written enough poems, you begin thinking, well, maybe these will make a book. And sometimes you'll find that you're writing poems, as I am right now, that constitute a sequence. And that's a wonderful thing to happen. When you find that you're writing poems in a sequence, you know, you're never afraid, you're never lonely for poetry, because you always know that you have another step to go in the sequence. You plan it out, you know, as you fall asleep, there's going to be more.
That's a really interesting point. I think one of the delights of being in the middle, we've talked about the miseries of the Gobi, but one of the delights of being inside a project is that you're not alone.
Right.
You can be washing the inside of the refrigerator shelves and be thinking about what tantalizes you about what you're writing. And I think I can't imagine a life without a book in progress. I think it must be very lonely, because when I wake up, I'm starting to think, you know, I mean, where am I in this chapter, and who are the characters, and what's the argument exactly, and does it make sense? And And I'm fascinated by the material. And I do think it is a way, writers very rarely admit this. They usually talk about the toil and the trouble and the misery and the loneliness and the goby, which I admit.
It's true.
But there's also an extraordinary sense of being befriended by a project, of being haunted by it, and by other people or the writers or the verse or the fiction that you're dealing with.
Yes, you have something that you are, in a sense, doubled with or coupled with. It's a part of you, and if you don't have it, then there is a sense of loneliness or rootlessness. I mean, it kind of explains why Virginia Woolf would have breakdowns after she finished a book, because she didn't have the book with her. I mean, she immediately would have a breakdown when she finished a book. Then when she started a new book, she turned back into the sane, brilliant, witty writer that she was.
Yeah, desolation, abandonment. It's done. It's not there for you any longer.
Right. I would say that, working on Still Mad got us through the pandemic.
Well, a year of it.
A year of it, it's true, we're still in it. I mean, I'm still of it, so it's in me, but yeah.
I loved hearing about your revision process, and it's something that in our workshops at the Hudson Valley Writers Center, we talk about constantly, that it's, in many ways more important than even the creative act of writing the first draft, the second draft. It's interesting to hear the two of you talk about your revision, sentence by sentence being rewritten. Can you talk a little bit more about your revision in Still Mad?
Well, I think one of the things that we were very aware of is that when we wrote the Madwoman, it was for an academic press. It was for Yale University Press, and we knew we were writing for an academic audience, and that the book might be, if it did well, it would be taught to students. Whereas we tried to write Still Mad for the common reader, the person Virginia Woolf, to go back to Woolf, would have called the common reader. And I think for us, the issue there was transitions. That's what we really focused on. If we were going to have three authors in a chapter, for example, the chapter on the 60s about three angry voices is about Sylvia Plath, Adrienne Rich, and Nina Simone. We wanted, and there could be thought breaks, but we wanted to really work on transitions, and we worked a lot on that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did, but we also, we were conscious, I think, I'm glad you're stressing that. We felt we were writing a trade book, and it was a book that we wanted to appeal to general readers. And so we found ourselves being not as academically oriented as we ordinarily would be. We weren't really doing deep, we didn't have the time or the space to do deep readings of the texts that we were discussing. We were discussing them as part of a whole cultural and political context that was interesting to us and that we were trying to cover, to historicize.
We were always happy to be able to include spicy bits. So we were writing on Susan Sontag, and it is true, we mentioned it in the slide presentation, that we did not read these feminist essays, which are mind-blowing, by Susan Sontag, that she produced in the 60s or so, no, 70s, right, Sontag? 70s. Yeah, early 70s. We had not read them in the 70s. We didn't know anything about them. We found them at the very end of the Library of Congress edition that her son, Library of America books that her son had put together. And they blew us away. But then when we found out that she had this contretemps with Adrienne Rich in the New York Review of Books, and they had a big argument in print, we were ecstatic to find out that they had this argument out in person and ended up going to bed with each other. So you see, we wanted to include as many spicy bits as we could, because we wanted to make it clear that the 70s was a very exciting time. And it was sort of unprecedented, and women felt that things were changing. They felt that the world was going to be different. And the reason we mentioned in our slide presentation utopias is because there was this sense that what had never been would come into being. That in fact, equality, which has never historically existed in the world, would somehow emerge and take hold. And there was this utopian faith in the possibility of gender equality. So when we were writing, as we said, for a trade press, we wanted to make that as manifest as we could to a common reader. And we would very often try to think of our mothers or our aunts or,
Daughters.
Daughters, people who are not academics, who might be able, would they get this? Would they enjoy this? Would this open things up for them?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true.
Spicy bits.
Well, it's interesting, when you talk about the 70s, that sense of everything opening up, of everything being possible, of the world being on the verge of enormous changes, enormous changes at the last minute. It seems to be so gone, even though we've had a woman who is the vice president, a woman who Nancy Pelosi, who still is in the position that she's in. I mean, we have those things, and yet I don't sense that kind of excitement and exhilaration that I think we had in the 70s. I don't think we have that feeling of possibility and of empowerment, which is, I hate to be moving toward the end on a depressive note, but.
The Atwood sequel to Handmaid's Tale was maybe not exuberant, but it was a hopeful book.
It was very helpful, but Sandra's point is underlined by the fact that when it was reviewed in the Times, the reviewer said that it was unrealistic. Because
that's right, that's true. But
because she said, the fact that they get the truth out saves them. They get the truth out about what had happened in Gilead, right? Saves them. And the Times reviewer pointed out that in a world of circulating falsehoods, that kind of hopefulness is really undercut.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just trying to cling to Yvonne Boland's line, our future will be the past of other women. Maybe it will.
That is a hopeful
line.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful line. It's a wonderful line. And
we have time for maybe one more question. We have people wanting to know what the most fun and exciting part for you two was in writing Still Mad. And if some of the people in the audience haven't read it yet, what would you like them to make sure that they do get out of the book when they finally take it out of the library or buy it from their local bookstore?
Well, I loved writing the part on Nina Simone, but I also think I didn't know her music in the 60s, and I was astonished how feminist her lyrics are. But I also will read just a little bit of a poem by Anne Carson called God's Woman, which we thought might serve as an epigraph to a book titled Still Mad. So this poem by Anne Carson is called God's Woman. Are you angry at nature? Said God to his woman. Yes, I'm angry at nature. I do not want nature stuck up between my legs on your pink baton or ladled out like geography whenever your buckle needs a lick. Now that broke me up. Sandra found it, and good for her. I mean, I know Anne Carson's work, but that was a hilarious bit.
I have to say that I loved writing about white suits. I loved writing at the ending, that whole part at the ending. I mean, unfortunately, it goes bad, but there was a part where we were writing about at the time of the election when Kamala Harris was wearing a white suit and she was parading around the stage, and it was as though the whole history of the suffrage movement came back to life on this huge stage in Delaware. I loved writing about that, and then of course things went bad, and we couldn't just end on that note. But fortunately we had Amanda Gorman to cling to at the end, a new generation. So that's good. That's hopeful.
That is hopeful. That
Yeah.
was a beautiful moment and I think we all needed to see that. And it's beautiful to see poetry at the center stage too, especially after Trump and especially after everything that's happened.
Right.
We love Anne Carson here. We have to tell you, she was our largest audience at the Writer's Center in my time, which is only 8 years. Our largest audience was for Anne Carson.
That's
And
interesting.
people were sitting on the floor and packed in, and it was probably a fire hazard. But we had a very interesting night with her a few years ago, and she is quite something. I was very excited when she said that my book sounded nifty to her because it's a book of poems about Antigone, and
Oh,
and
yes,
so
that would interest her.
That's
yes.
right. Yes.
So thank you so much, the two of you, for being here. It was
Yeah.
such an honor to have you. And please, everyone, don't forget to read the book. Here it is, Norton. You can get it anywhere. And don't forget, if you haven't read The Madwoman in the Attic, there's this. And I also recommend this. It's The Madwoman in the Attic After 30 Years, which is also a very interesting book. So thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate your time and all of your insights. And we will have this up on YouTube starting from tomorrow, probably.
Wonderful.
And we want to thank you again for being here. And we can't wait to see your new work.
Thank you so
Thank you for
much.
having us. Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Lovely.
Really had a wonderful time.
Thank you.